Thank you for joining us today. It's lovely to see you all. So welcome everyone. My name is Beth Vorenyuk, and I am the chair of the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. I would like to acknowledge that I am calling in from traditional, unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I offer this land acknowledgement in the spirit of reconciliation and in acknowledgement of the road here in Canada we have yet to cover in terms of achieving reconciliation with the people who have lived on this land for generations and generations before others came. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Please introduce yourself in the chat if you would like to. Let us know who you are, where you're calling from, what you're interested in. I'd like to introduce to you Monique Querier, who is the coordinator of the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada. Monique is handling all our tech support tonight for us, and just like to turn the mic over to her for a couple of words. I know most of us are very familiar with Zoom these days, but just in case, Monique, over to you.
Hi, yes. So I just want to welcome everyone. And while our speakers are speaking, if you could please keep your mics off in order that we can all best hear them. If you have any questions, for me, put them in the chat. There'll be time for a question and answer period later. So people will be free to turn their mics on then and ask questions. So I think that that's all. And as I say, any questions, direct them to me in the chat.
Thank you, Monique. Again, welcome. We're using the Zoom meeting format tonight to keep this session informal. We would like to have an exchange. We'd like to know what you're thinking. We'd like to know your response. Please, when we get to the Q&A, we'll have people turn on their mics. If you've got a question in the meantime or a comment, please pop it into the chat and we'll keep the discussion going. So just on behalf of the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada, I'd like to welcome you to aligning Canada's Korea policy with its feminist vision that we are very pleased to co-sponsor with Korea Peace Now. Most of you on this call today know that the Korean War has not officially ended. We know that Canadian troops participated during the hot period of this war in the early 50s. And when we fast forward to today, most of us in Canada, what we see of North Korea are the news reports of nuclear tests and of human rights concerns. As in so many conflicts, women are mobilizing to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. We've seen in the last few years a wonderful global initiative that brings together the Nobel Women's Initiative, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Korean Women's Peace Movement for Peace, Women Cross, the Demilitarized Zone. And today we're going to hear from a number of key actors in this process. We're going to hear about the opportunities for peace on the peninsula, Canada's role, Canada's potential role, what the Korea Peace Now campaign has been doing, how they have been mobilizing, and news from the region. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada, we are primarily a volunteer network of individuals and organizations. We are about 80 in total now, and our primary purpose is to monitor the Canadian government's implementation of its commitments to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So we're very, very pleased to co-sponsor this session today. We're going to hear from some marvelous speakers. We're going to hear from Patty Talbot, who is the team leader of the Global Partnerships Program at the United Church of Canada. And Patty brings more than 25 years of work with the United Church of Canada and has been very active in the Korea Peace Now program and bringing a Canadian perspective to these discussions. We're going to be hearing from Young-Mi Cho, who is the executive director of the Korean Women's Movement for Peace. And Young-Mi is the executive director of this organization and has years of experience and on efforts to end the Korean War. And she has particular expertise in building relationships and partnerships among government, civil society, and other organizations. Then we're going to be hearing from Christine Ahn, who is the founder of Women Cross the Demilitarized Zone and the coordinator of the Global Feminist Campaign, Korea Peace Now. We know Christine as a determined and skilled advocate. Her writing has appeared in numerous publications like the New York Times. She's also known for her media appearances. So if you get a chance to Google Christine and Samantha Bee, you will see the multiple talents of Christine on display. We're going to hear from Yogyong Ko, who is a consultant for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom for the Korea Peace Now campaign. And Yogyong has served as the executive director of the National Campaign for Eradication of Crimes by U.S. Troops in Korea and on multiple other networks and committees. And she's an expert, bringing years of experience on the impact of the U.S. military presence in Korea. We're going to have comments from Senator Mary Lou McPhedran, who's going to wrap up our workshop, our webinar after the question and answer period. Senator McPhedran is a longtime women's rights advocate here in Canada. She's a skilled human rights lawyer, and she's known for her support of peace movements and women peace builders around the world. Before she became a senator, Mary Lou was also a member of our network. We're very pleased to claim her as one of our own, and she is a welcome and supportive ally to the work that we do here in Canada. So those are the voices you're going to hear from in a few minutes. But to kick us off, we're going to play a short video from Canada's Women, Peace and Security Ambassador, Jacqueline O'Neill, who very much wanted to be with us tonight, but could not for other commitments. So she has sent greetings and words in the form of a video.
Hello et bonjour à tous et à toutes qui nous rejoignent. Greetings from Ottawa, the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. I am so sorry that I cannot be with you live. I would love to greet my dear friends for whom I have so much respect and to listen to what I know will be a great discussion. I do want to congratulate Korea Peace Now and your tremendous partners on your report and to thank you for doing an event specifically focused on Canada, of course with the Women, Peace and Security Network of Canada, which is always holding the government's feet to the fire, as you should. When I first learned of the work of Korea Peace Now several years ago, thanks to Christine, before I was in government myself, I was one of many people, like many Canadians, who did not know that the war was not over. I knew the word armistice, but I didn't fully realize what that meant. And I really appreciate, for that and many other reasons, the perspective of this report and of your activism, which is making sure the ultimate goal is about meaningful peace, not just a ceasefire, and defining meaningful peace as a feminist peace. I was really struck reading the report. There's a great photo, page 33. Women from the two Koreas meet at Panmunjom in 1992 to discuss the role of women in creating peace in East Asia. And we know that there are always stories like this. There are always women working for peace. There's a whole section of the report about it, of course. But it was really a reminder to me of how long Koreans living on the peninsula have been without true peace and how a feminist approach needs to center and listen to those voices and address the power structures that continue to prevent them from being able to define their own futures. I know no one wants a recorded long video, so I'll end here, but just to say thank you again for your work, not just for your analysis, but your presentations of solutions and recommendations. Hope you have a great discussion. Merci, 감사합니다.
So we'll have to send our thank yous to the ambassador, and we will be sure to send her the recording of this session so she can watch it afterwards. I do know that she was disappointed that she couldn't join us today. So let's, after those initial words, let's get started. And I'd like to turn the floor over to Patty. Patty, you have the mic.
Great, Beth, thank you very much. I want to start by saying right away, although the Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War, it is not forgotten for Canadians of Korean heritage, for Canadians connected to those who died in the Korean War, Canadian veterans who fought in the Korean War and their families, Canadians with ties of faith and or friendship with the Korean people. Nor should it be forgotten by all Canadians, any Canadians who seek just peace, genuine human security and human rights in Northeast Asia and globally. I would say that this reality and the current context call really for what I would name as a reset of Canada's Korea policy, one that is more centered on the Korean people and the Korean peninsula, a reset that would be more in line with a feminist foreign policy that would foreground the voices and rights of women and other marginalized groups, promote dignity and inclusion, and push for a more just, peaceful global order. Let me name two ways that Canada could reset its Korea policy to reflect these goals. Number one, and most important, is to implement a peace-first feminist foreign policy. And that means that Canada would give a priority for engagement in ending the Korean War, just as this report tonight that we're noting calls for. Korean partners from North and South Korea are unequivocal. Peace first, end the war. Canadian action could be tangible in a number of ways. Canada could reframe the call for denuclearization away from a focus just on North Korea to a focus on the peninsula and the region. Canada could gather like-minded countries to convene a conference that would urge negotiations toward achievable goals and ensure that participants include Korean and global women-led civil society organizations, because we know that if a durable peace is to be negotiated, women need to be involved. A second key change to reset Canadian Korea policy would be to articulate just that, a Canadian Korea policy that would step away from our current full and vocal support of US policy. Canada's done it before, most notably in relation to Cuba, where Canada and Mexico alone did not succumb to the strong arming of the US blockade against Cuba, but actually maintained a myriad of relationships with the Cuban people. The US maximum pressure policy of isolation plus international sanctions against North Korea has had zero impact, I would say, on the DPRK nuclear and missile program. But it has strengthened the resolve of the North Korean leadership, and it has inflicted untold harm on women and children and other vulnerable groups, as North Korea's access to medicine and food and other essential goods are limited. I would say a made in Canada Korea policy would have two key elements. The first, dialogue. The second, engagement. Dialogue could come through reactivation of Canada's diplomatic relations with the DPRK. In 2001, Canada established relations with North Korea in support of South Korea's then President Kim Dae-jung's policy of engagement with North Korea around issues of food security, human rights, denuclearization, and regional stability. Sound familiar? And yet Canada has suspended bilateral relations since 2010. Today, some 20 years later, after the initial establishment of bilateral relations, Canada should support President Moon Jae-in in his efforts to advocate for dialogue with North Korea and to encourage negotiations between the US and North Korea. Canada could demonstrate our commitment to dialogue by seeking accreditation to North Korea for the Canadian ambassador in Seoul and resuming regular travel to Pyongyang when travel is possible. At the same time, Canada should receive the credentials of the North Korean permanent representative to the UN in New York, because we know North Korea would welcome such accreditation. Former relationships like this would allow Canada some credibility, some opportunity for relationship building, and to build our expertise as well as our commitment to relationship with the Korean people. Second, a Made in Canada Korea policy would highlight engagement. And for that, I would say we need a much more flexible approach from Canada. Dialogue simply isn't possible when one party is being held in a chokehold by the other. I've said it before, we'll say it again. Canada must end its unilateral sanctions against the DPRK that are in addition to UN sanctions. These Canadian unilateral sanctions severely restrict interactions between Canadians and North Koreans, including humanitarian and development-related cooperation. Not only are these sanctions morally and ethically, and I would say legally indefensible, but they're politically ineffectual for the stated goal of denuclearization. I would say the Canadian government itself needs to make a tangible commitment to engagement and collaboration. One example, how about Canada committing to multi-year funding to the Canadian Red Cross? The Canadian Red Cross has responded to every single appeal launched by the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, related to the DPRK, and maintains a solid working relationship with the National Red Cross Society in North Korea. Its involvement with the National Committee there involves capacity building and training for monitoring and accountability. How about Canada working to diversify its support for the DPRK away from a singular focus on UN agencies to support Canadian-led relationship building, like that led by the Canadian Red Cross, the United Church, and other NGOs. Consistent Canadian backing for these kinds of efforts hold the potential for long-term impact that directly relate to the goals of the feminist foreign policy. Canada can and must do more. If we want peace, we need to help make it happen. Thanks, Beth.
Thanks so much, Patty. Thanks for starting us off with those really concrete suggestions, concrete ideas of the way Canada could move forward on building peace and live into its feminist foreign policy ambitions. So that's a really good opening to the discussion. I'd like to now turn the floor over to Young Mi, who will lead us through the next part of our program for tonight.
Okay, good evening and good morning. Yeah, nice meeting you all. Thank you for giving me this great opportunity to introduce Korea Peace Now Global Campaign. My name is Young Mi Jo, Executive Director of the Korean Women's Movement for Peace. Thank you to the Women, Peace and Security Network in Canada, and thank you Senator Marius for participating in this important webinar. I met you in Canada in 2019, and I want to salute your activism and your vision for peace. And thank you to all of the organizers of this webinar for inviting me a presentation today. Before we start the webinar, we would like start my presentation. I would like to show the film which Korea Peace Now Global Campaign made it.
For more than 70 years, the Korean Peninsula has been locked in a state of war. U.S. tactics of maximum pressure, sanctions, and isolation have failed to resolve the crisis. In fact, North Korea has only amassed more nuclear weapons. But it doesn't have to be this way. When there's been engagement, diplomacy, and acknowledgement of the root cause of the conflict, the unresolved status of the Korean War, there have been steps toward peace. According to President Jimmy Carter, Ending the Korean War is the only way to ensure true human security for both Korean and American people. To understand why a peace-first approach is the most effective strategy for resolving the security crisis on the Korean Peninsula, the global campaign Korea Peace Now released the Path to Peace report in February. The report also calls for the inclusion of women's groups and civil society in the peace process. That's because research shows that when women are involved in peace processes, an agreement is more likely to be reached and to last. Between 1991 and 2017, women's groups were involved in 71% of informal peace processes. Women's participation helps to legitimize the formal peace process among the public, and that's exactly what we're doing. Through the dedicated, effective work of Women Cross DMZ, the issue of a peace agreement between North Korea and the United States has moved from the back burner of policy debate to the front of mind. They've convincingly demonstrated that we cannot end North Korea's nuclear program without a comprehensive peace. We engage senior officials. We work with members of Congress on legislation calling for an end to the Korean War. We mobilize grassroots communities to take action. We amplify our message in the media. We raise awareness of the human costs of the unresolved war and center the experiences of women. We bring feminist peace builders together to discuss our vision of the peace process.
The more we connect our work, the more we align our work towards a shared vision, and we do that strategically, then I think real impact and change can happen.
We're cultivating the next generation of leaders. And we're redefining what makes us secure by democratizing U.S. foreign policy. Peace is the only way forward, and with women leading the way, we will end this war.
Yes, Korea Peace Now, Women Mobilizing to End the Korean War is a global campaign to educate and organize an advocacy for a Korea Peace Agreement. We are a growing movement of civil society organizations working for an end to the Korean War, lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. So Women Cross DMZ and Nobel Women's Initiative, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Korean Women's Movement for Peace officially launched the campaign in March 2019. And this year marks 71 years since the outbreak of the Korean War. And hearing yesterday marks the 21st anniversary of the joint North and South Declaration on June 15, 2000. This means over 70 years of pain, suffering, and division for the Korea peace. Militarizations, tensions, and mistrust between nations and between people, the arms race and nuclear threats, a lack of human security and sustainability. Since 2019, the Korea Peace Now campaign urges all parties involved in the peace process to ensure the full, effective, and meaningful participation of women and civil society groups. And we work with members of Congress in US and the National Assembly members in Korea on legislation to the Korean War. And we mobilize grassroots communities to take collective action and to collective their voices. On the US side, multi-generational Korean American veterans, young people, we are working on raising their voices together to call for an end to the Korean War. And we also work with the grassroots organization based on members organization and women's peace organization in Korea. Korean Women's Movement for Peace is organized by the Korean Women's Association United and Women Making Peace and National YWC of Korea and Korean Women's Alliance to work to collect grassroots voices to advocate for peace and gender equality and educate and empower women and girls. We've shown with our reports whether the Path to Peace report, which will be introduced by Christine in 2019, we published the human and gendered impact of sanction. We developed an awareness of the human cost of the unresolved war and center of the experience of women. And we also bring women peace builders together to discuss our vision of the peace process. So we organized the Northeast Asia Women Peace and Security Roundtable in Beijing in 2018 and throughout June in 2021. And together, 84 countries have adopted the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security in 2000, and Korean Women's Movement for Peace participated in the Civic Public Diplomacy Research, which is organized by the Blue House. So I was one of the co-researchers, and I suggested the Women, Peace and Security Ambassador like Canada. After the research, President Moon appointed the South Korea's first ambassador of gender equality, whose mandate include the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And besides this, we are holding various international forums and conferences. 70 years later, the Korean War has not ended, and despite of the effort of Korean people's movement and our government, including 2 signed agreements in Panmunjom and Pyongyang Declaration, and end to the Korean War, we still not have peace. So ending the Korean War gives not only the people of Korea, but all of the world. The fact that it has not yet been achieved shows us that unfortunately not yet reached the necessary critical mass of people sharing this understanding. We need more support and engagement for different levels of international community, including Women, Peace and Security Network, and more meaningful involvement of civil society, in particular women and girls, and more international support for the dedicated efforts of Korea's civil society. And on transnational feminists to be recognized that it is critical to end the Korean War, not just because of the threat of the nuclear threats that would foremost impact of the Korean people, but because of the status quo of the unresolved war is violence, and violence against women, also separated family, and innocent North Korean civilian living under the sanctions. Ongoing Korean War situation is an ongoing threat to the peace in Northeast Asia and the world. So we are in the ongoing new Cold War situation, which means there are no regional cooperation and no international and multinational framework where peace and security issues can be addressed. So Canada and Canadian civil society are really huge important. And thank you for your ongoing efforts, and I hope Canada's feminist foreign policy goes through a good approach and commitment. And we are longing for peace. We are calling for peace. We want peace now. Please join our work. Thank you very much. I will stop here and hand it over to Christine.
Thank you, Youngmi. I'm just going to step in before Christine starts to thank you. Thank you for that brilliant overview of the Korea Peace Now campaign, what you've been doing, what brings you together. Thank you for joining us so early in the morning, your time. We're really grateful to have your voice with us. And we really appreciate your remarks. And thank you for bringing that video. I think that also really helps people, give people another window into the work of Korea Peace Now. And now I will turn it over to Christine to dig a little bit deeper into the Path to Peace report and explain a little bit more some of the analysis and the recommendations. Christine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Beth, and everyone for joining us today. It's a deep honor to have worked closely with so many Canadian feminists, Janice Alton, Mary Wynn Ashford, Susan Basile, Catherine Christie, Lynn Adamson, so many more, and obviously all the amazing women on this panel. And Canada and the feminist foreign policy, which so many of you have fought and made happen. We look to you as an inspiring model, and because of your work and groundbreaking advocacy and organizing through the feminist foreign policy, the campaign through the Nobel Women's Initiative received some support. And so we really want to thank Canada and obviously the Women, Peace and Security movement in Canada for making it happen. So I'm going to speak briefly about what is a peace first approach, which is what the report is about, and why it should be central to advancing a feminist foreign policy. For decades, the US and its allies have tried to pressure North Korea, as everybody on this panel has spoken about. Pressure, form of sanctions, military exercises, political isolation, and it hasn't worked. In fact, it's only exacerbated the problem. For example, a recent study found that joint military exercises that the US, and I believe Canada is also part of as the UN command, routinely conducts with South Korea doesn't deter North Korea, but instead, quote, incites provocative rhetoric and actions, end quote. Thus, despite being one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, North Korea is estimated to possess between 20 to 60 nuclear weapons. The risk of another devastating war in Korea remains very real. It's hard for us to recognize that when we're not on the peninsula, but for the Korean people, it is very real. Since the Korean War ended with just a ceasefire and not a peace agreement, the US-led UN command and North Korea have come very close to renewed military conflict. We remember that from the Fire and Fury era during the Trump administrations. Both sides have weapons pointed at each other, and they're ready to pull the trigger at a moment's notice. So we believe with this peace first approach that to convince somebody to put down a gun, you first have to convince them that they will not be harmed. We need to address the root cause of the conflict, which is the unresolved status of the Korean War, and to build trust and create the necessary conditions for denuclearization. And that's why a security guarantee in the form of a binding peace agreement must come at the beginning, not at the end of the process. So the Korea Peace Now campaign, we produced the Path to Peace report based on this basic principle. Peace now, peace first, without preconditions or sweeping demands. Our report explains how a peace agreement can advance issues such as denuclearization and improved human rights, and why it doesn't mean the end of the US ROK alliance. You can read the entire report as well as one-page fact sheets on the koreapeacenow.org website. I think we posted the link in the chat. So feminist foreign policy provides us with a framework for rethinking security away from a military first approach, which is basically what US, Canada, and all the other countries that are allied with the US is basically taking. It's a military first approach. It's not a peace first approach. So we are asking with the feminist foreign policy to adjust this. We need to recalibrate this. And so in the case of Korea, that means prioritizing, as Patty said so eloquently, the voices of the people most impacted, the women, the children, the people that are living under hostile policy against their lives, and who have a particular stake in resolving this crisis due to the gendered impacts of war and militarism. South and North Korea have become highly militarized societies, which is correlated with greater gender inequality and higher rates of violence against women. The unresolved state of war is used by governments on all sides to justify redirecting resources away from healthcare, childcare, and other social welfare investments that disproportionately impact women. In North Korea, widespread sanctions impact women economically, socially, and physically. For example, the UN Security Council sanctions that were passed, that Canada has been a part of implementing, bans North Korea from exporting textiles. Do you know who works in those textile factories? You know, instantly, over 200,000 North Korean women lost their jobs because they couldn't export textiles. So I just think, you know, there are these repercussions that go really deep throughout the North Korean society. Sanctions, they also caused the delays in delivering life-saving humanitarian aid. So international and national law, as the Women, Peace and Security framework and the agenda has been advocating, mandates women's inclusion in peace processes. And research shows that the full, effective, and meaningful participation of women in civil society will contribute to a more durable peace. Yet, despite a rich history of organizing through grassroots action on the Korean Peninsula and internationally, I love that Jackie recognized the first meeting of North and South Korean women at Panmunjom. This is the 30th anniversary of North and South Korean women and Japanese women coming together, and we're still at it. But yet, very few women have been invited to formal peacemaking processes. So I'm going to close by saying that Canada's feminist foreign policy can and must influence Canada's outdated and failed Korea policies. It's not enough to just give money to support. And I'm not saying that we don't need it and women's groups don't need it, but I think that it's coming to a head. Where is Canada's position vis-a-vis a military first approach or a peace first approach? Canada sails along US warships in Korean waters during joint military exercise. It backs draconian sanctions against innocent North Korean lives. Feminist foreign policy asks, what makes us secure? The pandemic has shown that all of our investments in militarized security has failed to protect human life. If we are truly to take the risk of another hot war off the table and prioritize what is best for Korean people, for Canadian people, for American people, especially those most vulnerable, we must end the Korean War. It will stop the rampant militarization, allow us to redirect resources towards investments in genuine human security, and it can play a major role in neutralizing the great power competition between the US and China, which is endangering everyone throughout the Asia Pacific region. And with women leading the way and a feminist foreign policy, I do believe we can bring an end to this Korean War. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. And what an eloquent case being made for peace first and a movement away from a military first approach. And the implications this has for people and what a feminist foreign policy could mean for turning this around. So thank you very much for those contributions. I'm going to now ask Young to take the mic to elaborate a little bit more on some of the points Christine was making on the impact of the militarization on the Korean Peninsula. And I also would like to thank you for joining us early in your time to bring these insights to us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Beth. And hello, everyone. It's great to see you all, even virtually. And thanks to the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada for coordinating this wonderful dialogue. Today, I will talk a little bit about the consequences of national division and the unresolved Korean War in South Korea. In the Cold War and right after Korea's liberation from Japanese occupation, the United States and the Soviet Union divided the Korean Peninsula despite the Korean people's desire to establish a single government. Korea's division was the precursor to the Korean War. This tragedy caused Koreans on the peninsula and in the diaspora to endure an interminable period of pain. Families have been separated for 70 years, and survivors of civilian massacres and sexual violence during the war are still unable to speak freely about what they endured. The South Korean groups in power have used the National Security Act, which criminalized contact with North Koreans or positive statements about North Korea could curtail freedom of expression and dissent. The act has played a role in red baiting and suppressing civil movement for democracy and social justice in South Korea and peaceful peninsula as well for decades. The hostile relations under the armistice has resulted in military buildup and an arms race on the Korean Peninsula. South Korea is now ranked 10th in the world in military spending and has become an overseas testing ground for the United States' new weapon systems, such as the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense THAAD missile system. Villagers who live near the new US military base for the THAAD missile defense system, including elderly women who have been protesting every day against the deployment. The continual buildup of high-tech weaponry, including nuclear weapons and hostilities on the peninsula, create dangerous circumstances where even a small accidental incident could lead to the outbreak of another all-out war. We cannot and must not make the mistake of repeating the tragedy of another war. The most realistic way to avoid another catastrophic conflict is to end the unresolved Korean War with a peace agreement. And Canada has an important role to play in supporting peace in Korea. For example, when I heard Canada created a feminist international assistance policy in 2017, I was very inspired. However, I was disappointed when a Canadian lieutenant general was appointed as a deputy commander of the US-led UN command in South Korea in 2018. During his term, the US-led UN command was criticized for abusing its power of approval to cross the military demarcation line between the two Koreas, which resulted in impeding inter-Korean cooperation efforts, such as sending anti-bird flu drugs to North Korea. I hope Canada will become an international champion of the feminist peace-first approach to ending the unresolved Korean War. This would begin to help heal the wounds of division on the Korean Peninsula and allow families to reunite. It would break the vicious cycle of disunity and allow parties to shift resources from military toward human security and sustainable development. I hope we can work toward this common goal together. Last year, hundreds of South Korean civil groups with religious groups launched the Korea Peace Appeal campaign to end the unresolved war. I would like to invite you and your friends to join the campaign and sign the appeal. I'll stop here. Thank you.
I am so sorry. Just when you think you know how to work Zoom, that unmute button would not unmute. Thank you so much, Yogyung. Thank you for that, for those calls to the Canadian government, for outlining some of the implications. I had no idea that South Korea was the 10th highest military spender in the world. That's an incredible statistic. So thank you to all our wonderful panelists. We've heard about the Korea Peace Now campaign, the urgency of building peace. We've heard some of the concrete recommendations on how to move forward. We've heard lots of recommendations for Canada, how a feminist foreign policy could be, what kind of changes this could mean for Canada's approach to the Korean Peninsula. We've had a couple of questions, and Christina started to answer some of them in the chat, but one maybe to take the question on China and the question on the current diplomatic situation, and see if the panelists have additional comments on what the current panorama with the NATO meeting highlighting China as a security threat to NATO. If you have any comments on the role of China and how you see the evolving diplomatic context? Any changes with the incoming Biden administration that gives you cause for hope? Anyone like to comment on where we are right now in mid-2021 on some of these diplomatic issues?
I can start on the Biden administration. You know, I think that he has done a fabulous job on domestic issues, but on foreign policy, it is the same old, same old. And unfortunately, on North Korea, they just completed a policy review on North Korea, and it doesn't really bode well. I think that we're seeing a lot of rhetoric that they're committed to diplomacy and engagement, yet they are continuing to maintain the sanctions. They are continuing to put the onus on North Korea. They have continued the military exercises with South Korea. And we believe that they are going to continue to keep in place the travel ban on Americans, including Korean Americans, from going to see their families, and banning, making it incredibly difficult for humanitarian or aid organizations to operate in North Korea. So I think, despite many people and Americans' high hopes for the Biden administration shifting course and taking America off the path of maintaining its endless wars, and the Korean War being the oldest of these endless wars, it just shows that unless people and grassroots people and civil society organizations, we push back and we organize and we call them out for this really regressive policy. But I am not hopeful. And that is why I think we tried. We sent them the Path to Peace report. Korean Americans, we organized a letter with 71 prominent Korean American leaders to the Biden administration. We have not heard back from them. We have not received an acknowledgement from the Korea desk of the State Department to say, we received your Path to Peace report, we will take it into consideration. That makes me feel like they are not being very democratic. They are maintaining a white old male and hawkish Korean Americans, because we're all facing this problem where, everyone's saying, the Biden administration has put forth the greatest number of women and people of color into these positions of power. And that is not enough when you don't have difference in ideology and values and principles, and you just have the people that maintain the same hawkish militaristic frame. And so we really, I guess I'm a little bit irritated right now, because I felt so much hope that they would come forward and shift as he committed to. That strategic patience didn't work, and they didn't really support the Trump administration's, symmetry. But where are they moving? And I'm not hopeful. And that's why I do feel like we need to all work together. And, I see there's 40 of us on this call, and it doesn't seem like masses, but never forget that a small group of people could really make something happen together.
Thanks, Christine. Are there others who would like to comment on that? I think part of raising our voices involves being well informed and and sharing what we know and sharing our different strategies. Would other panelists like to comment on the current diplomatic state of play before we move on to other questions? Patty, go ahead.
Thanks, Beth. I think that for many of us, feel that we simply don't have the luxury of time, that we can't sit back and wait. We've been in this kind of hold situation globally, given the COVID pandemic, and I think many of us, not just Americans, but others too, kind of waited with hope after the change in the American administration, knowing that there would need to be a domestic focus first, and then hoping that there would be an engagement on a constructive engagement for peace. And as Christine just said, that's not panning out. So what about us Canadians? I think, frankly, I continue to be puzzled by how Canada continues to so fully and vocally support the American policy of maximum pressure. It just puzzles me that it's a policy that's not working to reach its stated aims. It seems to be indicative for any goals around a feminist foreign policy. So and some people have said, well, in this time, it's impossible to move forward with engagement or talk with each other. Well, we're talking right now. Dialogue is still possible. So I frankly don't kind of accept the excuse that we just have to wait or that we can't move forward on the imperative for reaching out to each other, working on building relationships, and stepping away from a policy which is really, I would say, collective punishment of the North Korean people, which is the continued sanctions regime.
Great, Patty. I guess would have been interesting to have a representative from the Canadian government on this discussion to help answer some of those questions and help provide the logic for the continuation of policies that don't seem to be having any positive impact. The floor is open for questions from those of you joining us. If you'd like to ask a question, please write it in the chat or raise your hand, or let me know in the chat that you'd like to ask a question and we can open your mic. I have a question then. What do the policymakers say when you ask them? I guess, Christine, one of your challenges was they're not even engaging. If you can't even get a thank you for your letter in response, it's hard to know what they're saying. But Patty, what do Canadian policymakers say? And Young and Youngmi, what do South Korean policymakers say when you take when you write letters or when you have meetings? What kind of arguments are they mobilizing for the status quo in these situations? Maybe Young or Youngmi, would you like to tell us a little bit about your engagement with Korean policymakers and how they answer some of these challenges and questions?
Yeah, Youngmi will take that question because she has many experience with South Korean policymakers.
Great, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah. For peace on the Korean Peninsula, I think that the inter-Korea relationships improvement is more priority issue in Korea. However, there's a struggling because of the relationship between North Korea and the U.S. So we are still suffering from the conflict between the U.S. and China as well. But the Korean government is focusing on the good relationship between North and South Korea, but it is really difficult because of the North Korea and U.S. situation. So we must first support the United States and other countries to normalize the relations between North and North Korea and other countries. So that's why we just urge for a peace first approach as well. And the Korea government is always focusing on the development, the inter-Korea relationships as well.
Great, thanks. That's helpful. I see that Norma has her hand up, but first is Christine, a question in the chat for you. What about outreach to Kamala Harris? Has the Vice President expressed any interest? What kind of things has she been saying about women, peace and security generally, and has she made any comment on the Korean Peninsula in particular?
Not to my knowledge. And, I do believe that, I think the point that somebody said was about some of her positions, it would be great to engage her, and it would be great as somebody who is of Asian descent, be supportive of more progressive policy, U.S. policy in the region. But no, nothing to my knowledge.
Okay, thanks. And I see you've also put a question in the chat for some of the Canadian, Korean Canadians joining us today. If they've had difficulties visiting their families, what kind of impact this has had. So please, if you've got a comment on that, please feel free to turn on, raise your hand or turn on your mic, or to get in touch with Korea Peace Now. And Christina's popped a oh, it's Women Cross DMZ into the chat there, someplace to get in touch. Norma, you've put up your hand. Would you have a question for our panel?
Oh no, I have comments.
Okay, a short comment, that would be great if you've got a short one.
For one thing, I am very pleased with the work that's being done by the women. I went to the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom presentation here in San Francisco. It must have been 5 or more years ago. They had gone to talk to the whole of Korea and try to build unity and struggle and awareness there, and certainly awareness of the support in the US for their work of trying to end this murderous relationship to Korea. In line with that, we have to know and agree that the anti-China, anti-Russia establishment of an opposition by the United States is just the United States giving up opportunity for the continued profiteering by the war industry here, without which we'd have no economy whatsoever. There is, we talked with people who have gone to China, walked around and said, I've come to see how the Uyghurs are being oppressed, and the Chinese people start giggling kind of behind their because it's such a lie. So it's just an effort to continue the warring instead of, because that's where the profiteering is.
Right, right. Thank you. Thank you for your comment.
Oh, can I add just one thing?
Really briefly, because we've got other ones too.
I put it in the chat. I'd like people's expression of the cause to go beyond just what's gone on about Korea. Christine mentioned that. The whole relationship is, of course, the United States opposition to challenges to its hegemony.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much for your comment. For all the panelists, there's a question in the chat about what kind of support you most long for. What would help your organizing efforts? What would give you more energy and feeling of support and confidence as you take this work forward? Who would like to start on that one? Patty, do you want to, what kind of support would be the most helpful for you?
Yeah, good question. And I think that it starts with each person and in our families, in our churches, in our communities, in the networks that we're in. I think that as I started out, and many other people have said, there's a lot of stereotypes or misinformation or disinformation. I think a lot of Canadians, for example, don't know that the Korean War is not over. They may not even know that Canada participated in the Korean War and continues to participate in the ongoing militarization of the peninsula. So I think, part of what we who are committed to a just peace long for is solidarity in naming our continued engagement. And seeking for ways to build relationship. The United Church is really about people-to-people connections, but there are many other NGOs, feminists, peace building, academic, agriculturalists, or others who have worked at building people-to-people relationships, both in the north and in the south of the peninsula. So maybe I would say two things, you know, a commitment to know our history and our current engagement, and a willingness to engage to make a difference for change. You know, I think that Canada could reset its foreign policy if there was mobilization sufficient to do so. There's lots of grounds for us, both in terms of our vision and constituency in Canada.
Mm. Those are really interesting thoughts. And so engagement, more information. So maybe Young or Young Mi, how has the pandemic affected your organizing efforts? And what do you long for? And has it been more difficult this last year because of the pandemic? We know that we all have suffered and longed for more human contact over this last year. What has it meant for you?
Yeah, may I talk a little bit about that? Yes, we have spent very difficult times around the world and here as well. And there is few contact in person, but we still make many efforts to share our campaign effort and endeavors to around the world. And we invite people to join our campaign, even in virtually like today. So I hope you joined our campaign, and please share the past peace report and share our feminist peace first approach with your colleagues and friends, and please let them speak out to support our effort. That's my hope.
Thanks. So more solidarity, more information, sharing your goals, sharing your aims, sharing your principles. Christine, what can I ask you? What you long for?
Yes, I have a wish, and that is that everybody on this call, especially those of you in Canada, contact your representative, contact Senator McFedrin, who is going to say the final words, contact Jackie O'Neill. We really need those peace-loving Canadians to try to shift Canada's policy and not just step in line with the US. June 15th is actually the anniversary of when North and South Korea signed a historic declaration calling for an end to the Korean War, calling for reunification, and Canada having sent almost 30,000 US troops or Canadian troops to the Korean War. The UN command, the number 2 was a Canadian, Wayne Eyre. So Canada has a prominent role. It might be invisible or hidden, but it can, shift and, challenge the US in its regressive, antiquated policy. And so I really urge all of you to get organized. Unless we build up our power and we organize together and build a movement of people, we will never see an end to this war. And I think what we're all fighting for is a different kind of world that is not a militarized first approach, so that we could actually invest in the things that give us true human security. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks. And actually, that's a good segue, I'm sure, to what Tamara Lawrence is going to say, who is a longtime peace activist and a member of our Women, Peace and Security Network. So Tamara, the last question is yours tonight.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for coming and giving this briefing. It's so helpful. I'm really looking forward to the report. I'm a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, and as you mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, a few of our members participated in the Women's Walk across the DMZ, and I'm sorry that that Janice and Dr. Mary Wynn Ashford are not on the call this evening. You also mentioned at the beginning of the call that Canadians don't know very much about the Korean War and our participation in it. And I didn't know very much until I read Dr. John Price's book, Orienting Canada, Race, Empire, and the Trans-Pacific, and he investigated Canada's military role in the Korean War. And Canadian forces, of course, were complicit in war crimes, killing civilians and raping civilians in the war. And I also just want to say too that the Korean War is also considered NATO's first war. It was the first time that the NATO members came together and consolidated their command structure, a year after NATO was formed. And just coming off of this latest NATO summit and Canada adopting the NATO 2030 plan, which is really a blueprint for a new Cold War, and identifying China as one of the top threats is really going to be problematic. And so we really are going to have to work on two fronts. One is trying to tell our government, don't adopt this policy NATO 2030. And then also to really have a feminist foreign policy, because we don't even have that yet, and that's something that we desperately need. But my questions are, I'm wondering if you could share more information, maybe at a later date or in a follow-up email, about the June 15th, because maybe we could make that as a day of action, and maybe our organization, in partnership with other women's groups as part of the Women, Peace and Security Network, we could do something on June 15th, because Canada, like you said, is responsible and complicit. So I'm wondering if we could if we could hear more about June 15th, if that's going to be some sort of international day of action, and maybe what we could do. And then I'm wondering if there are any countries that have been more supportive in your efforts, that have been role models that we could look to say, look what this country is doing. Let's move away from the United States with a highly militarized foreign policy and to something different. Like, I'm thinking how Ireland has been very much better than Canada, for instance, on disarmament, particularly nuclear disarmament, and that's been a role model for us. So I'm just wondering if there are countries that have been more supportive of your efforts that we could look to. Thanks.
Thanks, Tamara. So we're almost out of time, but I'm just wondering if any panelists want to give one last 30 seconds, answer Tamara's questions, or any closing remarks before I turn the floor over to Senator McPhedran to wrap us up. Any final comments from our panel?
If it is okay, I will take Tamara's question. It's very shortly. I will follow up with you. Please send email address to me, please, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you for that offer, Yu-Young. That's great, and we can make sure we can connect the two of you if you don't manage to do that through the chat function now. Anyone else that would like to say a final comment? Nope.
I'm copying the chat. The chat closes with the closing of the screen, and I've left my email address if you want to ask me for it.
Great, thank you very much. Over to you, Patty, for the last panel word. That
I was just going to say very briefly, again, we can press for a made in Canada Korea policy that's built on engagement and dialogue. Feminists know that peace is a process, not an event, but we need to begin with ending the Korean War. So I would again press for all of us who are Canadians here and who care about a just peace, that we need to act and move together toward that goal.
Great, thank you. And now I'd like to call on Senator Mary Lou McPhedran for some closing comments and words of wisdom to wrap us up tonight. Senator, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you for the opportunity to speak briefly. I'm going to speak very personally. I've been to the DMZ, I've spent time in South Korea, I've met with women's organizations working particularly on trafficking and forced labor as a result, largely of the huge militarization of their society. And I think that when we talk about a feminist foreign policy, Tamara is absolutely correct. What we have is a feminist international development policy, and we have not really seen an extension in a whole of government approach. I do have one thing to say to Christine, and I do not say this with anything but the greatest respect and admiration. But one of the things I've learned being on the other side from my long time in civil society is that a month is the new week. 6 months is the new month. The amount of time that it takes to move the machinery of government. So this is really a blink of the eye for the Biden administration to think about the end of January to the middle of June. And I know you well enough, Christine, and your colleagues to believe that if you don't wear one, you have an invisible never, 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 never give up bracelet on all the time. And it has to stay on. And the kind of cross-border international connection is crucial. I will close by saying that one of the access opportunities that I have sometimes found helpful to be able to share with such excellent civil society leadership as we have heard and seen in this gathering tonight is that if you wish, I can request a briefing by Global Affairs Canada and on the Korea policy and various research that's underway, issues that can be resolved through discussion, or whether even if they're under consideration. So think about that. If a briefing of that nature would be of interest. Interestingly enough, it's not something that I've done with WPSN since I've become a senator, but I'd be more than happy to bring that to the table. And I would just close by saying to everyone on the call, it is true that the change will not happen from inside governments. It will happen from civil society leadership and building bridges into government. They're already doing that. And it's really a question of doing it more and sustaining the shared values and the shared commitment and building more of the shared action. And I'll do whatever I can to support that. And I salute every single one of you. Bringing peace to the process of analyzing not only feminist policy, but my last quick suggestion is to look at goal 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals and how that fits with the peace goals. 3 references to peace in the Sustainable Development Goals. And maybe that's an additional angle that we could work on together.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the concrete suggestion. Thank you for your wisdom that you bring as an activist now from the other side. I think we need to apply all of these insights. Thank you so much to this marvelous panel. I'm not going to try to summarize all your great insights, but I think we've heard many different calls for action, calls for collective action, calls for sustained action and calls to continue this kind of collaboration and sharing insights and strategies together. So thank you to everyone for joining us this evening, this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are. And we look forward to this being just one chapter in an ongoing relationship of mobilization and peace building. Monique has posted links in the chat one last time for information for those of you who are new to Korea Peace Now or the Women Peace and Security Network. Please stay involved, and we will continue to push for peace together and into the future. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.